please follow DiaLeb on all our social media platforms to benefit from the tips and recommendations prepared by our scientific committee with the purpose of raising diabetes awareness and serving our community. Our guest for tonight, Sarah Linklater, is the Chief Scientific Officer, CSO at JDRF, Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation of Canada, where she oversees the organization's research partnerships and projects and clinical trials in Canada. Previous to this, Sarah worked in scientific and medical publishing in the UK for 11 years, so you can imagine the experience. Most recently as editor-in-chief of The Lancet Diabetes and Endocrinology. She obtained her PhD studying immune regulations and gene therapy at UBC in Vancouver and at the San Raffaele Telethon Institute for Gene Therapy in Milan, Italy. Welcome, Sarah. I know your time is very tight. I really appreciate you being with us here. I do remember our first contact a couple months ago. We tried very hard to find the time, so I'm very happy to have you here with us tonight.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
So before I start my questions to you, Sarah, I would like to brief our audience about JDRF. Who is JDRF? What do you do? Your website actually is so rich and extensive that it was very hard task to brief the information in and make it short. So in 1974, a group of parents living in Canada had a vision. I think it's still our vision nowadays, a world without type 1 diabetes for their children and anyone impacted by the disease. It was from this vision that the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, JDRF Canada, was born 4 years after their founding in the United States of America. It has continued to lead the fight till today, becoming the largest advocacy and funding body for type 1 diabetes research globally, with their in-house scientists dedicating themselves to turning type 1 into type none. I do love this quote, by the way. It impacted me. So JDRF serves as a reliable reference and network for millions affected by the disease. Here I start with my questions, and please feel free to be as extensive as you want with the explanations. We are here to learn from the experience at JDRF. A question that many ask every day: can type 1 diabetes be prevented? And if so, what are some lifestyle implementations that could help? Sarah?
So the short answer is we don't know what causes type 1 diabetes. There are many different genetic and environmental factors that probably play a role, but there is no one clear cause. And what is clear is that it does not appear to be caused by any lifestyle factors such as diet, exercise, or exposure to one clear factor in the environment. So there is nothing that a parent or a family can do to prevent the disease at this point in their family. On the bright side, there are potentially some avenues to prevent the disease through drugs and biological screening that we can talk about a little bit later. And for those, we don't necessarily need to understand the causes, although that research will still continue.
By the way, I would like to mention here that one of our objectives at DiaLeb is to help with the research. We were not able to do extensive research ourselves, being a small NGO, but we did some surveys, we collected some information, and we are always ready to learn from experienced NGOs such as JDRF. So thank you for sharing your expertise tonight with us. So my second question, many people living with type 1 diabetes are aware that they will need lifelong treatment. As yet, there is no cure. We looked into your research though, and we found that JDRF's main pursuits is to find a cure for type 1 diabetes. And we do hope certainly that you do so. but you distinguish cure research into areas of screening, disease-modifying therapies research, cell replacement research. I know there are different topics, but can you please brief us a little on each of these potential solutions to curing type 1 diabetes?
Sure. So the reason that we're pursuing multiple different approaches to cure is that it's not going to be a matter of one size fits all. Everybody with type 1 diabetes has their own experience of the disease, and also the disease is quite different from person to person. And you can also imagine that a person that has just developed type 1 diabetes might need a different type of solution than someone that has had diabetes for, say, 40 years. And this is because underlying the need for insulin, there's something going on in the pancreas. And when around the time of diagnosis, there are still some residual beta cells or insulin producing cells that are still there. And so that is a really great opportunity to save the beta cells that are there, protect them, and dampen down the autoimmune response that causes type 1 diabetes. And so it is in that group that we would like to focus on what's called disease-modifying therapy to protect the beta cells and to stop the autoimmune response. So in that way, the beta cells that are left may be enough to allow someone to stay off insulin. So if you consider someone that has had diabetes for 40 or 50 years, they may have no beta cells left at all. So we could not use a disease-modifying therapy in that type of person. And in that type of person, we're looking to do what we call cell replacement therapy. And this is an area that is moving very fast as well. And in this approach, we are looking to find a source of insulin-producing cells that can be transplanted into a person in a very non-invasive way, probably initially with an immunosuppressive drug regimen, to prevent them from being rejected in the same way you would with a transplant, so that you would be transplanting a new source of glucose responsive insulin producing cells. So you could come off insulin and the cells would act like a replacement pancreas basically. So that's why we're approaching the question of cure from multiple angles. And you also mentioned the area of screening, and that is where we come to prevention. So we now know that we can identify children and adults at risk of type 1 diabetes by doing a simple blood test that looks for what are called biomarkers. So things that are circulating in the bloodstream that indicate a person is very likely to develop type 1 diabetes over the next, say, few months to few years. And if we can prevent them from progressing to clinical disease, well, we've stopped the disease before we started. And that's even better. So rather than looking for the cure, only one, we are looking for cures because it will look different in each person.
But this thing about preventing type 1 is totally new, right?
So it's been an active field of research for a long, long time. And biomarkers that we use to screen for people at risk are currently only used in the research setting. So even in the United States, where this is moving quite quickly, you can't go to your doctor and say, I'd like to get myself or my child screened for type 1 diabetes. This is not a standard test yet. So it's still very much in the research realm. That said, in the last 2 years, we had the first clinical trial of an immune therapy drug called teplizumab that showed that if we gave people at risk a short course of treatment with this drug, their type 1 diabetes was prevented on average for almost 3 years. Some people in this trial have still not developed type 1 diabetes. So this is really the first proof that we can delay the disease, and possibly with further research, we can prevent it altogether. So then you think we need to identify these people at risk so that we can give everybody the opportunity to take this treatment. And that treatment that I mentioned, teplizumab, is currently under review by the FDA in the United States. So if it's approved in the coming months, it will be the first opportunity on the market in any country. So it's moving very quickly, and JDRF's real emphasis now is to work out how we can introduce general population screening in different healthcare systems. So for example, there are a few different country-level pilot projects where they're introducing screening with this simple blood test in preschool-age children. Because if we could pick up almost every person that was at risk and treat them at the right time with the right therapy, they wouldn't develop type 1 diabetes and never need insulin. So that is the goal in the future.
Well, it's certainly big, and it gives me a sense of hope that I cannot avoid. I'm sure many of the people who will be listening to your explanation will feel that hope as well. We definitely hope it will be approved. But I have a question here. When you screen someone, even though still in clinical trials, and you see that this child is at risk of developing diabetes, only by the drug, or is there lifestyle adaptation or anything else?
So right now, the way that we believe we can minimize people progressing to diabetes is by targeting the immune system and stopping the autoimmune attack on beta cells. So the development of type 1 diabetes is actually takes months or even years. So early on, there is some trigger that starts that immune response. We don't know what the trigger is, but it may take many years even for the beta cells to die such that a person then requires insulin therapy. So we don't know of anything else that can prevent that decline of beta cells. The only thing that we know that we can do is to target the immune system. And there are no dietary or lifestyle things that are probably targeted enough that can stop that from happening.
I will come back later with a question about the beta cells. And for now, I would like to ask you, what are some innovations on the horizon that are going to make type 1 diabetes easier to manage for those living with the disease? And can you tell us a bit about glucose responsive insulins, or GRI? What exactly is that? Is it more of a theory at this point, or is research getting closer to making it a reality?
So also good news here is that there is a lot on the horizon to make management of type 1 diabetes easier. And that is both with drugs and with devices, and with making prediction and management of complications easier, because even with better insulins and so on, we still have residual complications risk later in life. So I'll start with glucose responsive insulins, because this was what you flagged in your question. So the idea of a glucose responsive insulin is that you would take an insulin by injection, or ideally by a tablet, and they would be active in the body only when glucose got too high. So if glucose was in the safe range, they are inactive. And once glucose begins to climb, they kick in and they bring glucose down. So this would almost completely eliminate the risk of hypoglycemia, because the minute glucose fell, they become inactive again. And ideally, we'd only have to take this once a week for a basal insulin, and it would make treatment much, much easier. So in terms of the stage of their development, there are many companies and academic groups working on these, but there's still some way to go before these are in advanced clinical trials. So it's fairly early stage. To have a glucose responsive insulin be completely inert, the biochemistry of it is really complex. So this has taken quite a long time to develop, and JDRF has made major investments in this area, and industry, pharma companies are also heavily invested here. In terms of other advances, JDRF has been very involved in advancing artificial pancreas technology. So these are systems that pair a continuous glucose monitor for measuring blood sugar together with an insulin pump. And the whole system is connected through an algorithm that allows the continuous glucose monitor to talk to the pump and tell it exactly how much insulin to deliver and when. So this keeps blood glucose very flat. You still have to bolus at meal times with these systems at the moment, but in the future, it's hoped that we have a fully automated system for insulin delivery. So in Canada here, there are 3 systems like this on the market, and I think the same in the United States, but there are many more coming. And our goal now is to make these more affordable and accessible and get them covered by our healthcare coverage system, and because currently most of them are not. But we know they make enormous differences for people with type 1 diabetes. So we are advocating with great gusto.
Well, these are definitely great news. We wish you the best of luck in getting there and making it a reality, although it will take much longer to get to us here in Lebanon, but we're always hopeful. So back now to the beta cells, my question is if could the new beta cells be destroyed by the body?
With cell replacement therapy, that's a very good question. So to back up a little, we know that islet transplantation is an effective means for getting somebody off insulin. So this is an operation, a surgical procedure that's used in people with very difficult to control or brittle type 1 diabetes. And it's used in very few patients in Canada. Only a few hundred have had it since the procedure was developed. And Canada is home to what's called the Edmonton Protocol, which is transplantation of islets from a cadaveric organ donor into someone with type 1 diabetes using a very well-defined immunosuppression regimen. So as with any organ transplant, you need to take anti-rejection drugs so that the cells from another organ donor are accepted by the body and continue to stay and work. And for many people that have that procedure, they're off insulin for years, and their diabetes is, you know, they don't have to take any insulin, and their complications risk is much, much lower. But inevitably, the transplants, they don't last forever. Most people that receive one either need another transplant or they have to return to insulin after about 5 years. And also, it's only available for a very few people with type 1 diabetes because of the limitation in the number of organ donors. So the ways that we are trying to get around that are to use stem cells as a source of insulin-producing cells, which we now know is possible. And there are clinical trials going on with a stem cell-derived product in people with type 1 diabetes by several companies that look very promising. But another challenge is the immune suppression that we need. So when we put the islets in someone today using the Edmonton Protocol, it suppresses graft rejection, but it probably also keeps autoimmunity at bay and stops the autoimmune response from killing those beta cells. So many researchers are looking into clever ways to make the transplanted product sort of be hidden from the immune system. So that might prevent both the graft rejection response and the autoimmune response. But initially, probably these therapies will be done with an immune suppressive regimen, which will keep autoimmunity at bay. But absolutely, once the autoimmune response is there, it will be revived again if the islets are replaced. So it's a really important question, and I think probably the most challenging to address with cell replacement therapy. On the other hand, if we are working out how we can modulate the immune system, say for prevention, we may be able to pair that type of immune therapy with a cell replacement therapy. So combination therapy is something that may be pursued.
It sounds really fascinating to hear, like, to stop insulin even for 5 years. I'm sure our people living with type 1, our community of type 1 are listening to this and thinking this is a dream come true. So we really hope that all those researches come to a happy ending, and most of all, that they will be available at an affordable cost in countries like ours. So fingers crossed, Sarah.
Absolutely. The cost considerations are very, very important. And right now, producing enough stem cell derived beta cells to transplant is too expensive to ever deliver this to a large number of people. So there's major investments going into how we can scale this up, use automation and kind of manufacturing processes to make it cost effective, because that would be a major limitation. And I should mention also, this is going to be a major benefit for people with type 1 diabetes. But we hope that a lot of these advances, whether it's devices or cell replacement, may also benefit people with type 2 diabetes who use insulin. And in fact, in some cases for cell replacement, it might be even simpler because we don't have the autoimmune response to worry about with type 2 diabetes. They probably require more insulin, So they would need more insulin producing cells, but it's a possible other benefit of our research, because a lot of our research does touch other diseases, type 2 diabetes, one of the main ones.
Interesting. So now we know JDRF is big on advocacy. How can someone become an advocate for type 1 diabetes through JDRF? We have Lebanese all over the world, and we have followers all over the world. So if someone is listening now, living in Canada, and want to advocate for type 1 diabetes with JDRF, what would be their role? How do they do?
So there are multiple ways that we work with volunteers, and we would describe JDRF as a volunteer-powered organization. We were established by volunteers. We still have thousands of volunteers that work across the country with us every year, and we couldn't do what we do without the help of our volunteers. We have many, many different types of volunteers, and one of them are advocates. And these advocates, many of them are youth advocates who are incredibly powerful in delivering their stories of what it's like to live with diabetes. And they visit, we arrange lobby days, and we lobby government in different provinces or at the federal government. We write many letters, and people can contribute letters through systems that we set up. And we also meet with different members of parliament to share our stories and to encourage them to tell the story of type 1 diabetes in their daily work as well. And recently we have been successful in contributing to change here in Canada by getting provincial governments, because our health systems are provincial, to cover things like continuous glucose monitors for certain patients with type 1 diabetes. And we here in BC, where I'm based, we just had an announcement a couple of weeks ago that some of these devices will be covered for type 1 diabetics in BC. So we will continue to work province by province to increase the choice and the opportunities available for people with type 1. So if you are in Canada and would like to advocate for JDRF, please reach out. We would always welcome more volunteers and more voices towards our cause.
Excellent. So you mentioned that type 1 diabetes numbers have been increasing over the last few decades, and also that what has become quite striking, I'm quoting here, is that the disease is occurring much earlier in life. So why do you suppose it might be appearing earlier in life than in previous decades? We know that about type 2 diabetes. Now we're hearing this about type 1 diabetes. So what could be the explanation? And in the website, it says it's a mix of genetic and environmental causes, but it says also that the environmental cause is unclear. So can you please clarify this and give us your personal, maybe, hypothesis on the cause, Sarah?
So it's true that the incidence of type 1 diabetes is going up in many countries and has been going up for decades. I think the causes of this are unclear, probably very different to the increase in type 2 diabetes, which we know is partly influenced by environmental factors and the food environment that we live in. So with type 1 diabetes, we are also seeing it in younger and younger children, especially in developed countries such as Canada and the US and Western Europe. So about 90% of people that are diagnosed with type 1 diabetes have no family history. So although there is a genetic component, it can come out of nowhere. And this is what makes type 1 diabetes incredibly hard for families that don't know a thing about it. So the rate at which type 1 diabetes is increasing cannot be explained by genetics. And that's how we know environmental factors must play a role. There could be many, many different factors, but two factors that seem to be related are exposure to different viruses in our environment, whether through vaccination or natural infection. And the other is changes in the microbiome, and there might be some overlap here. So the intestinal microbiome has been a major study and major area of study in type 1 diabetes. So this is the microorganisms that naturally colonize our intestines, and they are modified by many, many things, including diet, breastfeeding as a baby, exposure to antibiotics, all of these things really change the diversity and the makeup of the intestinal microbiome. And several studies have linked changes in the microbiome in the first 1 or 2 years of life with type 1 diabetes risk later in childhood. So there are also some really exciting epidemiological studies that have looked at countries with a very similar genetic population, but a very different level of hygiene in their society. So we would have a much more diverse and different microbiome in a society that wasn't sort of everything covered in antibacterial stuff versus a country that was almost too clean. And in countries that are I guess, not as clean and there's more diversity in their microbiome, just as a consequence, they have less type 1 diabetes. So, and you would also imagine that less diversity and a different pattern of the microbiome in early life changes your immune responses as well. So there is definitely a link, and we are funding some research now that looks into the link. And if we can manipulate the microbiome in people at risk, maybe we can prevent type 1 diabetes. And there are some actually very large trials going on looking to do exactly that, recently launched. So these are just two possibilities. And I think there are many, many more.
But you mentioned breastfeeding. Can you please clarify that point? Does it is a breastfed child at less risk, or how is the correlation?
So there was a theory once upon a time that breastfeeding versus formula feeding early in life changed a child's risk of type 1 diabetes. And there was a major study with heavy Canadian involvement called the Trigger study that ruled that theory out, that there is no difference. So parents need not be concerned that the way that they have fed their child could change their risk. There has been no strong evidence to suggest that that is one of the major risk factors. But we know that breastfeeding can change the microbiome and have, we don't know if there are clear effects. Yes, but for type 1 diabetes, no major impact.
Okay, so this is in relation to diabetes, but just to clarify things for our audience further, breastfeeding is still good for the children and we encourage you to do so. We're just stating that in relation to preventing or maybe helping your child not to get type 1 diabetes, it was proven not to be true. But for other things, I'm sure it's very good and healthy for your child. So my next question, understanding pre-type 1 diabetes is central to your goal of curing the disease, as I understood from checking different sections on the website. You've determined 3 distinct stages to development of type 1 diabetes. Could you please tell us how they differ and how each is significant to your research in curing type 1 diabetes?
Sure. So we talked a little bit before about there is a long period before clinical symptoms when type 1 diabetes is developing. So JDRF was really involved in helping to define what we call the staging of type 1 diabetes. So briefly, stage 1 of disease development would be when the autoimmune response has begun in a person probably with a background susceptibility. And what happens then is the autoimmune activity can be picked up by these biomarkers, which are what we screen for, what are called autoantibodies. And these are markers that the autoimmune response is going on. There's no symptoms. Someone would not know that they had these antibodies. The only way we can pick them up is by a blood test. So right now in stage 1, there's no, glucose control is totally normal. In stage 2 disease, the autoimmune response and these autoantibodies are still detectable. And there is a little bit of abnormality in the ability to bring glucose down after a meal. So again, a person wouldn't know that they had stage 2, but if we did a blood test for autoantibodies and an oral glucose tolerance test, or checking blood glucose after a meal in a clinical setting, we would be able to tell that something was beginning to become dysregulated. Then stage 3 disease is what we all know as type 1 diabetes. That is when we have the autoimmune response and glucose control becomes really difficult, and a person needs insulin therapy to survive, basically. And we're now beginning to talk about stage 4 diabetes as well, which is because in stage 3, we believe there are still some beta cells left that could be saved if we can stop the autoimmune response. But in stage 4, the beta cells, we can't get them back. There are almost no functional beta cells left. And so that is the group that we need to do cell replacement for. So each of those stages will require a different approach to cure type 1 diabetes, basically. So that has also helped us sort of streamline our research approach so that we are addressing all stages of disease.
Well, I can tell you how much I'm pleased to be sharing this information with our audience, and I'm really looking into future collaboration between our two NGOs, although we are, again, much smaller NGO, and we learn from such a great organization such as JDRF. And I'm very, very happy to have you with us tonight. So here I come to our last question before we see if we have a question from the audience. Because I know your time is limited, we decided our live for today is going to be strictly a little past half an hour, so we give you the chance to run to your other meetings, appreciating, of course, that you gave us this time very kindly. So again, looking into your website, we found a widely interesting project called the Artificial Pancreas Project. You did mention earlier a little bit about this. The name is definitely inspiring and it creates high hopes. It happened to me when I read about that, when I heard you speaking about it. Please tell us more about it. Like, how many years do you think it will take to come to reality? And will it be affordable? I know it's like predicting the future, but I know from your experience, you might have certain answers. So will it be affordable to most people living with type 1 diabetes? What can you tell us about that?
So we talked a little bit about artificial pancreas systems coming to market. And the Artificial Pancreas Project, I think, was started by JDRF back in 2006, and they really decided they were going to focus in this area to bring these systems through the research stages. They advocated to regulators to create a roadmap for how they would be approved, because nothing like this was approved yet, and regulators and manufacturers of these devices didn't really have they needed a roadmap. So that's what JDRF helped to create. And they really accelerated the development of these systems and their approval to get the first systems to market. So in terms of how long, we've got it. We are there. And so the first systems were improved, I think, in the United States in 2016 and in Canada in 2018. And in Europe, they have several systems approved as well. I actually am not sure about Lebanon, but I think little by little, these systems will become more and more part of standard care and will become more accessible in other countries. I think, the first stages are to get the individual components available. So continuous glucose monitors and insulin pumps as standalone devices can provide great benefits. And I know that some of those are probably available with you. And there's also a major DIY movement, do-it-yourself movement, where people are creating their own systems. So these are not approved, but more and more people are accessing these systems and creating their own because of the great need for closed loop control. So we also did a number of other things to accelerate development in this area, such as what we called the Open Protocol Initiative. So rather than having manufacturers have a closed system that users would have to buy as a package, we encouraged manufacturers to have open software and open systems so that people could buy the monitor they liked, the pump they liked, and use an open algorithm to make their own system in a way that works for them. Because we know type 1 diabetes is very personal and not every device works for every person. So they need to be able to make a system that works for them. So we did a lot of things in the area of artificial pancreas development, and now a lot of that work is being carried forward by the manufacturers. And while we're still investing there, the big part of our work is done now that some of these systems are on the market, and our work is now moving more towards advocacy. The systems are still expensive, but as more and more of them come onto market, the prices will become competitive, and we will begin to collect more data on how much benefit they provide for patients, so that governments will need to begin to cover them for more and more people with type 1 diabetes.
So interesting, and such an inspiration to listen to you speaking.
And Jackie, can I make some comments on the global nature of type 1 diabetes and the advocacy and the volunteers?
I'm delighted to hear you, and I'm sure our audience is as well. Please do, Sarah.
So JDRF is an international organization, and JDRF Canada is one of 6 affiliates. And right now, the research that JDRF International funds is being funded in 19 different countries around the world. And we're funding over 375 projects in those 19 countries. And we don't mind where the research is happening. We are just looking for the best research by the best researchers, so that is the fastest route to cure diabetes. And the more that we can engage the global type 1 diabetes community in the mission and in the research, and share information between the type 1 community and the research community, the better we are doing towards our goal. So I think in the coming months, we are looking to engage the community globally more and more, and looking to have a global footprint, even more than we do today. So we would be delighted to engage other diabetes organizations and share information like we are today.
Wonderful news you're giving me here. I certainly look forward to collaborating, and I'm sure our people from our type 1 community have great ideas they would like to put on paper, and maybe have small proposals, and guided by such experts that you are at JDRF, I'm sure we can get somewhere. And people here in Lebanon, I don't know how aware you are of that, but we have great universities, great research centers. We are certainly facing big challenges lately, starting from the economic situation, then the pandemic, and we had civic riots, and then we had the unfortunate Beirut blast. We've been really undergoing many tragic things together, not one at the time. But nevertheless, I'm sure that I mean, when I say we, I say the Lebanese community, we as Lebanese can be of great help related to research. And we at DiaLeb are certainly very enthusiastic to collaborate on any type of project that serves the type 1 community, and to be putting our little help and little push to go ahead with more researches and come out with positive outcomes, of course. Well, this is great news, Sarah. I started to feel the enthusiasm already.
Right.
So, Sarah, I know I don't want to keep you any longer. I want to thank you from the heart for being with us tonight, for your time, for the interesting information you shared with us here. I want to extend big thanks to our audience. I'm pretty sure that this episode is going to be viewed over and over, given the amount of new information that you shared here with us. Please remember, everyone, that you can watch this episode on our YouTube channel and still on our Facebook page. Follow us on social media. Sarah, I want to wish the best to JDRF, to the people, to the